What's up, castaways? This is Miles Away. Welcome back to another video. So the last tier list that I made on the best hardware synths got a great response, so I thought that I'd do another video, this time focusing on the best software synths. So this tier list will cover every single soft synth that I've ever played or owned, and again, this is 100% my own opinion. If you disagree with my rankings or you think I missed a synth, leave a comment below. As always, if you like this kind of content, please like, subscribe, and feel free to suggest other tier lists that I should do in the future. These are really fun for me to do. All right, let's get started. All right, guys, so here we are in the tier list. So obviously there's a lot more synths this time for me to go through, so I'm gonna go pretty fast. If you do have any questions about specific synths and why I rank them in more detail, feel free to ask me in the comments or let me know your thoughts. Okay, cool, starting off. Absynth 5. Now, Absynth from Native Instruments is a really cool synth. I think it flew under the radar of a lot of people, but it's great for pads, for cinematic, for ambient. So back when this first came out, I think it would have been an easy A tier, but just because the UI is pretty clunky and kind of outdated in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of synths now that do the same kind of thing, but in my opinion, do it a little bit better. Stuff like Alchemy or Omnisphere are great for pads. I'm going to give Absynth a C. I think it didn't age as well as some of the others from Native Instruments. Speaking of which, number 2, Alchemy. Now, Alchemy was originally created by Camel Audio, which was a really cool synth, and then Apple bought it and made it a stock plugin for Logic. What that means is that everybody who is a Logic owner got the greatest thing ever, but everybody who wasn't, unfortunately, lost out on a great synth. Alchemy, for me, is one of my most used instruments. I use it for all my granular stuff, for all my pads, for all sorts of cool sampling and stuff like that. For me, Alchemy would be an easy S tier, except for the fact that I know not everybody else can use it now, because unfortunately Logic bought it out from Camel. So for that reason, A tier. Okay, next up, the Arturia V collection. So now I have some mixed feelings about the Arturia V collection. Now, in one hand, it's an amazing educational tool for teaching people about synthesizers and synthesis, but on the other hand, I don't know how accurate a lot of their models are. For example, their Oberheim model is nowhere near as good as GeForce's OBE, and their Minimoog model doesn't really sound like a Minimoog. Now, granted, I own an older version of the Arturia V collection, and I haven't used it too much recently, but honestly, I think for me, I'm going to have to go B tier for the V collection because what it's doing is really admirable, but it's just not quite up there quality-wise with some of the absolute A and S tier synths. Okay, next up. Everyone's favorite meme, the Delay Llama. Now, the Delay Llama, I have used this only in one song, and it has never been used ever since. Great meme, terrible synth, D tier. All right, next synth on the list, we have Dext by Digital Suburban. Now, for those of you guys that don't have Dext, go download it right now. This is a completely 100% free, faithful recreation of the famous Yamaha DX7. It sounds, honestly, to my ears, almost exactly like a DX7, and it has all the original presets. Now, I'm going to be totally honest, I suck at programming this synth. I've never owned a DX7, but for the presets alone, this is going easy A tier for me. The E-piano sounds, the brass, I use these all the time when you want that 80s classic sound, and it's 100% free, and it's on every platform. What's not to love? All right, next up, UHE Diva. Now, Diva, I think I should either thank or curse for the rest of my life because this was my gateway drug to buying thousands of dollars of analog synths. The moment I first installed Diva on my computer was the demo. I was a broke student and my mind was blown. I remember there was one pad in particular, I think it's called Deep Space Diva or BS Space or something like that. It's one of the first pads if you have Diva, and I heard that and I had never heard a synth sound like that come from my computer. So for me, this synth immediately became my obsession. My entire 2019 EP, Miles Away, is pretty much the entire sound of that EP is Diva. And I just can't say enough good things about this. This is probably my favorite absolute synth ever, and it's why I got into doing what I do. So S tier for Diva. Next up, Synapse Audio Dune 3. Now, Synapse Audio Dune 3 is a really, really cool synth. Now, I wish that I used it more. I've used it a few times. I think I have a code for it from years ago, and it sounds great. I've used the presets a lot of times, but I wouldn't say that I'm an expert on sound designing it. However, the quality of sound is unmistakable. I think that Dune is one of the best sounding virtual analog synths on the market, and that's going to get an A tier for me. Sound quality alone, Dune 3 just sounds incredible. All right, Native Instruments FM8, the OG, the classic. So FM8, I think, is a really important synth in music history because a lot of people think that Skrillex made his original growls for that Scary Monsters Nice Sprites EP in Massive, but in fact, he stated multiple times it was in FM8. So that sound of early brostep and dubstep, a lot of it was made popular by FM8. I think FM8 is an incredibly powerful synth, much like the Dex synth from Digital Suburban. I am not the best at programming it, but I do find that, compared to something like Dext, it doesn't quite sound quite as good for me for just the classic like e-piano, bread and butter, classic FM sounds. I'm going to give FM8 a B, but I could totally see the argument if you're a diehard fan for it being in the A. Next up, Form by Native Instruments. Now we're kind of getting into the weird Native Instruments synths that are like installed if you buy complete, and you probably check them out for a while, but unless you're going diehard, you don't really get too into them. Form's like a sample manipulation synth. I think it sounds a lot like Alchemy, and it does a lot of the things that Alchemy does, but it's nowhere near as versatile. I used it a couple times, and then I went promptly back to Alchemy. C tier. It's fine in the bundle, but I wouldn't buy it alone. Okay, next up, Kontakt. I know this is not technically a synthesizer, but how can I not include it? It's Kontakt. It's probably been on every single one of my songs for the last, 5 years, 6 years since I bought it. And I used to always go around collecting weird, interesting Kontakt libraries to then use. Under the hood, there's an incredible amount of synthesis tools, which is why I included it. It's basically like a sample-based synthesizer, if you think about it. Easy S tier for Kontakt. It's amazing. And if you don't have it, if there's one thing that I would highly consider you guys get the paid Kontakt, and you can download tons and tons of free Kontakt libraries from sites like Piano Book and more. Next up, Native Instruments Contour. Really interesting synth. I think Contour it's a phase distortion synth, phase modulation. There you go. So it's kind of like FM8, but using a little bit different engineering science behind it. To me, this synth sounds phenomenal. I think of all of the weird Native Instruments synths that have kind of been released and added to the complete bundle, by far Contour sounds the best, and it's one that I actually used quite a bit in my productions. I'm going to give it a B tier. Next up, the OG Massive. Massive is an absolute classic, a legend. A lot of my early music that was before Miles Away, when I was trying to make really aggressive, trance and dubstep, I owe a lot of my sound to Massive. It was absolutely classic, and I think Massive for me is going to be a B tier. Again, it just didn't quite age as well as some of the others. The fidelity in something like Serum is better to me, but it is still really good. Massive X. The evolution of Massive. Now, Massive X tried to capture what made Massive so good, but increase the sound fidelity and add a bunch of new features. I think for the most part, they largely succeeded. I just don't find myself quite as drawn to Massive X as I do to some of the other synths on the list, but I can definitely understand why people do. It does sound really good. B tier. Next up, the Memory Moon 80. This is a CS80 emulation, and unlike the Arterial one, I actually think this one sounds pretty solid. It still doesn't sound like a real CS80 though, and for that reason, I'm going to give it a C. Kind of has all the limitations and quirks of the CS80, but doesn't sound anything like it. I'm really hoping that someone makes a really good CS80 emulation soon, like a really good one. GeForce, if you're listening, I think you guys should make a CS80 emulation. I would totally review that. Memory Moon, C tier. All right, Native Instruments Monarch. This is a really cool synth. So this is basically a Minimoog Model D clone from Native Instruments, and it's monophonic. Why would you make a software instrument monophonic? For authenticity. So I've heard some comparisons, and again, I've played real Minimoogs lots. This doesn't really sound like a Minimoog, but it sounds really, really good. For that reason, we're going into B tier. I used to use this for all of my basses before I got my Sub 37, and it sounds fantastic. There's one preset in particular called Submissive that is on like every Miles Away song from 2017 to 2019 when I first started, and for that reason, B tier. ReFX Nexus. Now, Nexus is, again, much like Kontakt, it's a sample player more than a synthesizer, but it's an absolutely iconic part of music, EDM history. So with Nexus, with Dance Piano 2K7, some of those classic presets, they really shaped the sound of like 2010 to 2013. However, really, really limited, and I honestly think Nexus is kind of outclassed by a lot of other things today. There's not that much hands-on control, and it sounds very kind of dated to me. I'm going to break some hearts here. I'm giving Nexus a D tier. Back in the day, would have been solid B. I don't even have Nexus installed on my computer anymore. It's just not anything that I have any interest in. Next up, Omnisphere. Speaking of things that sort of took over Nexus and do the same thing but better, Omnisphere is going easy A tier. I actually don't use it that much. I don't have it on my new computer because I found that it just was quite a CPU hog. It just wasn't for me workflow wise, but man, it sounds so good. And this is the perfect synth if you like preset scrolling. There's thousands of presets. You can also control it from your analog synth. To me, it's like a Nexus, but 1,000 times better and can go way deeper if you want as well too. Highly recommended. Just doesn't have a place in my workflow. All right, next up, Reaktor Prism. So Reaktor Prism is an interesting one. I think sadly, this is one of those synths that just sort of gets included in a bundle and probably was a lot more relevant when it first came out. It's a physical modeling type synth, if I understand the definition correctly. So it does have its own unique way of doing things. But I think just for the sound quality and what I'm looking for, I rarely ever reach for it. It's kind of one of those ones that's good to have if you ever need that specific sound, but I'm going to give it a C tier because I really don't use it much anymore at all. Speaking of native instrument synths that I actually do use, however, Razor. Now, Razor is probably the most unique synth on this list because it is the only additive synth on this list. Actually, that's not true. Alchemy can do additive because Alchemy can do everything and it's amazing. So Razor is an additive synth, which means it's got a very different way of doing sort of synthesis than your standard subtractive synth. There's no filter. Instead, there's things that add or subtract more partials, more harmonics. For that reason, I'm going to give Razor an A. It's super unique. It sounds great. And if you're looking for something to do really gnarly bass sounds, this is absolutely one of the best synths around. I used to do a lot of my crazy bass fills on it and it sounds great. Next up, Reaktor Blocks. So Reaktor Blocks is a virtual modular synthesizer, and it sounds really, really awesome. I think Reaktor Blocks is, along with maybe like Razor and Monarch, one of the best sounding native instrument synths where just like the sound quality is really, really close to hardware. So for that reason, I'm going to give Reaktor Blocks a B. I think it's great, but again, like, for me personally, I don't really like doing the full modular thing by clicking wires around, so it doesn't have very much of a space in my own workflow, but the few times I have used it to build like really gnarly mono synths and stuff, it does sound really, really good, and it's very deep. It's a good gateway drug to Eurorack, so yeah. All right, next up, UHE Repro 5. Now, much like Diva, Repro is basically aiming to be as close to analog as you can possibly get without actually being analog, and boy, do they succeed. Now, Repro, I don't use it nearly as much as Diva because I just like the mix and match modular capability of Diva, combining like a Jupiter low-pass filter with mini Moog oscillators, but Repro sounds fantastic. I think if you want that profit sound, this is by far the closest you're ever going to get in software. For that reason, I'm going to give it a B. You know, it would be like a high B, low A. I know I'm not doing these in order again, like I said I would. Apologies. But yeah, this is probably the closest to being an A versus a B. So, you know what? Let's just sort these out right now here. I'm just going to do that. We're going to go like this. There you go. That's more accurate now. And then if I were to put, yeah, there you go. Let's put Omnisphere right here. There you go. Now we've got it in proper order where the B is closest to the A and the A is closest to S. You guys happy? There you go. Okay, cool. Next up, Rounds, another quirky native instrument synth. Now, Rounds is really cool. This is sort of my intro to paraphony and paraphonic synths because it is a synth that is able to sort of combine a lot of the really cool things about switching up oscillators for each note you play, but it also has the lack of limitations that a digital synth has. So really, really cool synth. I think there's a lot of good things about it, but it's pretty limited for, you know, what its uses are, unless you want that weird paraphonic sound, which is cool. There's no real reason why I would ever use that over something like Diva, because Diva sounds better. Next up, Serum. Now, Serum is the easiest S tier of my life. I'm actually going to put it above Diva even. Serum is the synth that really taught me synthesis. So I got obsessed when it first came out, doing everything from building my own wavetables, creating crazy EDM gnarly bass patches, creating lush pads, and I'm actually working on a Serum preset pack right now that collects all of my presets that I've used, that I've made for myself for all my Miles Away music over the years. Before I got my hardware analog synths, this was pretty much my entire setup: Serum, Diva, and Kontakt. And I think with these three synths in S tier, you can pretty much do anything. The sky's the limit. Each one of them does something so different. And, you know, Serum is just an absolute classic for a reason. How could we not give it S tier? All right, guys, camera just died, had to recharge. So moving on, the next one on our list is Sforzando. Now, Sforzando is really cool. It's a completely free plugin. It's a synthesizer, sound font player, and I believe also a sample player, but it is super limited. The main thing I have ever used it for is replaying those sounds that Porter Robinson used on his album World. So if you guys want to learn how to do that, go check out Sforzando. It's free. However, I'm going to give it a D tier as an actual synthesizer because it can't really do much synthesis. Next up, another one on the infinite list of native instruments, interesting synthesizers that most of you guys probably have never heard of because they never made big waves, Scanner XT. Now, Scanner XT is actually really cool because it's a very unique synth. Basically, it takes samples, chops them up almost granular-like, but what makes it really unique is that it can actually morph between presets in this really intense, like harsh industrial way. So that's pretty much all I use it for, but I actually have used this thing more than I have some of the other synths on this list, because when you click the morph button between two samples and set the length to really long, it creates this horrible, like, but really awesome, like tearing sound. I use that on a lot of my fills where I'll like do this tearing sound and then I'll repitch it to the right key of the song. It's really cool. So check it out for sure. But as an actual synthesizer, super limited, it's going in the C tier. Next up, the Super 8 synth by Native Instruments. Now, to me, this synth, I'm not really sure why it exists, unfortunately, because the whole thing is they're saying like, hey, we're going for that vintage classic sound. But again, not to be mean, it just doesn't sound nearly as good as Diva or even Repro. In fact, I don't even think it sounds as good as something like Dune 3, which isn't even supposed to be vintage. It just sounds really sterile to me. There's never been once a reason why I would use Super 8 over Diva, D tier. Sylenth. Now, Sylenth, my first love. I completely fell in love with Sylenth when it first came out before I knew anything about synthesizers because the presets seemed way better than the other presets on my stock Logic synths. There's such a wonderful history of great tracks that have been produced with Sylenth. I know Avicii used it a lot, so it's definitely a great synth, but I do feel sadly there's just not really that much reason to use it anymore. I don't even think it's in 64-bit. Somebody let me know if it's in 64-bit now. But yeah, for me, I don't even have my license of Sylenth installed on my computer. I just kind of moved on past it. And, you know, for better or for worse, I'm going to give it a C tier. All right, next up, getting close to the end here. The Tal UNO Juno clone. Now, this is a cool synth. So this is basically, in my opinion, the most faithful sounding recreation of the Juno 6. But yeah, basically the UI looks exactly the same. It'll teach you how to use a Juno and it sounds awesome. They even have a really faithful version of the chorus, which you can use as a standalone plugin, which is really cool. However, I do feel like it lacks that, you know, last 10% to really make it into our top echelon of synths. So I'm going to give it a mid B tier. It's good, but again, I actually like the Juno style sounds better on the Diva, and the chorus, while it's great, you can get it as a plugin like I mentioned, so there's not really a reason to use the synth. I could just make a really great sounding patch in Serum or Diva and then throw the chorus on there. Next up, the Mangle, probably the most unknown synthesizer on this list. It's a granular synthesizer, really cool synth. It does a lot of really interesting things, and as far as granular synths go, it is one of the more fully featured ones. But again, Alchemy just kind of does all of the same things, but better in my opinion, although there are some really cool kind of randomization features and slicing features that you'd have to really dig under the hood in Alchemy to get to. I'm going to give this one a C tier, but basically the Mangle, thumbs up. I want to see more granular synthesizers. Like I would even like to see like a hardware version of something like this. But you know, as far as actual usability, it's pretty low down the list. Getting down to our last two here. So next up we have UHE Terrell. Terrell is like their free synth. So if you haven't downloaded it already, I highly recommend it. It's a great little sounding synth. There's a bunch of really good usable presets if you're just learning, and it's pretty straightforward to design sounds on and pretty simple. I'm gonna give it a C tier. I think it's one of the best free synths, but if you have Diva or Repro already, to me there's not really much reason to use it, but it's really cool that they went ahead and gave that away for free. All right, the last synth on our list. We're finally here, guys. Thank you for listening to me talk about this for so long. So the last synth is Vital. So I have used Vital a decent amount, but I wouldn't say I am as comfortable with it as I am with Serum. But I'm going to give it a solid like high B tier. Let's give it, right above Massive, right below Repro. It sounds really good. But to me, I still like the workflow better of Serum. Serum is the top synth on our list, not only because it's iconic, but because it has the best workflow of any soft synth ever. And I think that even though, the sound might not sound as good as my OB6, I still use Serum all the time because of how quick it is to dial up really complex patches with crazy complex modulation. And Vital, I'm sure there's a lot of people who will say the same, but for me personally, I just didn't find it quite as intuitive as Serum. So that's why still getting a really respectable B, but that's it. There you go. That's every single one of them. All right, so that brings this video to a close. What do you think? Did I get it right? Do you disagree with me? Again, let me know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Please leave a like and consider subscribing if you enjoyed this content, and I will see you guys in the next video.